Hello guys, I'm back. Okay, so today we're going to talk about a really interesting subject. This is going to be a tough pill to swallow, but I feel that I need to talk about it. Why do I need to talk about it? I need to talk about it because racism, racial issues, changing the fabric of countries is going to cause us changing the ethnic fabric of countries. It's going to cause us problems on this planet. Hi, thank you for coming. Say hi in the chat box. Why changing the fabric of countries is going to cause us, the ethnic fabric, the color fabric of countries, is going to cost us, not cause, but cost us serious problems. And the root of this doctrine is known today as the Kalergi Plan. Kalergi Plan. It's spelled K-A-L-E-R-G-I, Kalergi Plan. And the Kalergi Plan, which is the modern name, it had different names 400, 500 years ago, but the name today is a more sanitized version of this. And why am I talking about this? What the hell does this have to do with TTIs? I strongly believe that there is nothing new under the heavens. And the same creatures that caused the injustices on this planet millions of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago, all the way up to today, is the same creatures that executed the problems that caused this planet to go into extinction and then be reborn, because nature cannot die. It's the same plan we see today under a different name. The root of this name today is called the Kalergi Plan. And if you don't know what the Kalergi Plan is, I suggest that you go look it up. Okay, hold on. I can't use the chat box here for some reason, so I'm going to try to see if I can use the chat box while I'm chatting with you guys. Here. Okay, so I'm going to say hi in the chat box. Say hi, everyone. Now, some people are not going to like this message. Some people are going to think this message is a racist message, but I don't give a shit. Some people are going to take what I'm saying and twist it and use it for their own agenda. And some people are just going to get it. Okay? To understand the Kalergi Plan, what is the Kalergi Plan? Well, the Kalergi Plan is this diabolical scheme, and I don't know if they're doing it because of the birth rates in Europe and the fear that Europe and the ethnicities, the white Caucasian ethnicities in Europe, will go extinct because they are below, they're not even marginally on their birth rate, they are below their birth rate, meaning that you're looking at, within 50 years, the population of Europe diminishing. Many people across the planet would be cheering and be happy because of mass genocides. But I want to look at something. And I want to go a little bit deeper into this, because I want to tie this out to TTIs. So if you, my viewers, can bear with me through this journey, we can come to an understanding. you'll get where I'm going with this. So what is the Kalergi Plan? The Kalergi Plan is this diabolical scheme to basically brown Europe. Brown Europe. And what's happening is that there is this tide in Europe where there's this anti-color coded tide that is rising against mass immigration and immigrants, etc., etc. Now, the Kalergi Plan is diabolical, and I hate it. And I hate it on the premise that before they called it Kalergi, which is the modern day for mass invasion, they called it civilization when they did it in Africa, when they did it in Hawaii, when they did it in Guam, when they did it in Australia, when they did it in New Zealand, when they did it in Papua New Guinea, when they did it in India, when they did it in China, and when they did it in the Middle East. Today, the Kalergi Plan is called mass immigration. They are using mass immigration to facilitate the Kalergi Plan. But the Kalergi Plan is not new. The Kalergi Plan is old. In fact, it is hundreds of years old, and it was under a different name. Some call it colonialism. Some call it conquest via the conquistadors. Some call it mass migration. But the difference between the Kalergi Plan today and the story is that many justify what happened for 500 years to Black people and brown people and Asian people, but they do not justify when the same shit is happening to Europe. And I say, hold your horses. You're wrong. And you're hypocrites. Because you can't justify it and call it civilization when it's done externally. But when it's inflicted on you, you have a problem with it. Make up your mind. Now, where am I going with this? Some would say this is racism, and some would say this has nothing to do with TTIs, and they're not going to listen, but I don't care. There's a point I'm making to this. And I'm going to tie this out as to why, if the Kalergi Plan is executed, whether it's executed with the browning of Europe and the whitening of Africa and the whitening of Asia, it will lead to two things. It will lead back to a feudal system. It will lead back to a feudal system, and feudalism is not dead. It's very much alive. And where there is feudalism, there is a little known monster in history that people fear to talk about. And that monster in history is slavery. Some would say, well, under feudalism, they weren't slaves. I would disagree with that. They were very much slaves, but they called their slaves peasants. Nonetheless, if you were not a feudal lord, you were a slave. But they called it peasants. Even though I say no, the way you treated the people who were not feudal lords was the same way you treated slaves. Now, what does this have to do with TTIs? The future and something that was historically wrong and corrected, feudalism in the past, and slavery and all these things. People don't like to talk about slavery because of the brutality and the ugliness and the injustice of slavery, but we have to remember the same creatures, and I don't give them human status because they don't deserve it, the same creatures that facilitated slavery, The same creatures that facilitated feudalism, the same creatures that facilitated the extermination of 200 million Native Americans, the same creatures are the ones who are facilitating the browning of Europe and the whitening of non-European countries. Now, let me preface my statement by saying this. I believe in diversity only in places that are historically diverse. And I'm going to preface that with an explanation, and I'm going to counteract that with what equality means. When you are born a human, you are automatically equal, regardless of your color, your sex, your religion, your race, your identity. Being born a human automatically gives you the passport for equal rights. Let me say that again. Being born a human automatically gives you the life passport for human rights. Okay? Now contrast that with something like diversity. In nature, nature cannot thrive in abundance without diversity. Not every plant is the same. Not every dog is the same species of dog. Not every cow, not every deer, not every, fish is the same species, right? Within that particular type of animal, there are various species. So we see that nature in and of itself is in fact diverse. So we have to respect the boundaries of diversity. But when it comes to human beings and equality and diversity, this is where the lines must be drawn. You are born equal as a human being, so therefore no one has the right to diminish your equality to any other human being. But when it comes to diversity, human beings are a little bit different from animals in the animal kingdom, and nature, just a tad bit different. It's very interesting because human beings are so unique, such a unique creation, that we tend to operate abstract of nature. Let me put it this way. You would go to a dog park, and I'm not a pet fan, but still, I have respect for animals. I love them and I respect them, but I'm not a fan of any type of animal. You would go to a dog park, and it's peculiar because you would see a brown dog that might be a Labrador, a pit bull that's gray and black, a Chihuahua that's white, and they're all dogs. And it's interesting because they all bond and love each other because they recognize, hey, that's one of me, even though they're three different categories of the same species, dogs. But human beings are a little bit different. This is where we veer off, we're divergent from much of nature. Human beings tend to gravitate towards places of comfort, unlike animals. For example, again, back to the dog. You would go to a dog park and you would see all the dogs like, and they're all playing with each other. And none stops to say, wait, you're a Labrador, I'm not talking to you. You're a Chihuahua, I'm not talking to you. And you're a pit bull, you're going to bite me. They all see each other and they all play. Human beings are a little bit different. Human beings tend to gravitate to places that are comfortable for them that are familiar to them and to places where they have a likeness and a historical relationship. Let me make my point. Back to the Kalergi Plan. The Kalergi Plan seeks to, it's a nefarious plan when you think about it, it's really diabolical. It seeks to, today, historically, it did something else. But today, it seeks to make Europe brown. That's what it wants to do, with the hopes that Europeans would become, by becoming more brown, they would be inferior. So you see the racist agenda. They're associating Black people with a lack of intelligence, number one, and Europeans with higher intelligences, number two. Then they want these two cultures to merge, which is not the first time in history because Europe was Black for 700 years. But they seek to relive this in a more nefarious way. When Europe was in fact Black, it was in a civilizing way, not in this nefarious way. They seek to use that as a means of weakening Europe. And the way in which they do it is they destabilize foreign countries, okay, through war and genocide and plundering, same template. That's why I call them these creatures, and I don't assign humanity to them, because it's the same historical template they use. They seek to do this by destabilizing the countries where these non-European whites come from, weaken their countries, and then flood Europe with angry, bitter, disheartened, non-white people. It is the same way America was founded, but just a tad bit different. America's founding was a tad bit different when America had their refugee and immigration crises at the beginning of what we call America, United States today. They were fleeing from the same feudal lords. This is why I say history is a benchmarker. When you're trying to understand why is it that you're a TTI and you're not getting justice, I always tell people, go back and look at the past. Go back and look at the injustices of the past. Be brave, even if the injustice happens to Black people or Native American people, look at it, because it's a template for you to see what you're in and for you to see where this world is headed if we don't put a stop to this shit. Now, the United States is a little bit different. When the United States originally had their refugee and immigration crises, and some would say, no, they didn't come here as refugees, they came here as conquistadors. That's not true. The founding of the United States was an immigrant and refugee crisis. It says very clearly when you're studying American history that the British left Britain because of economic and religious persecution. It was the same feudal system. It was the same horrific feudal system that caused British Europeans to leave England and come to the United States as refugees. The same system. So that tells you how long this plan has been in effect. That same feudal system, when we look at the 13th and 14th century medieval Europe, and when the Europeans got so sick and tired of these feudal lords, what did they do? The 13th and 14th century medieval Europe, when the Europeans got sick and tired of being peasants, hashtag slaves, when they got sick and tired of this, They cut the heads off of these feudal lords. They beheaded them. That's what they did. Go study the history. They killed them. They hanged them. They crucified them. But what happened during the 15th century? When Europe deposed of their feudal lords and demanded land reform in Europe, the feudal lords in the 15th century didn't take it. The 15th century gave, at the end of the 15th century, we see the rise of these same feudal lords leaving Europe in search of what? The very same thing that the European peasant or slave class was killing them for: land and equal rights. They took that feudal mindset out of Europe because the Europeans had enough of these feudal lords. And they brought that mindset of feudalism under a different name. When they exported it out of Europe, they called it what? Conquests. That's what they called it. But it was still feudalism. It was still feudalism. It was the same creatures who were imposing slavery on Europeans. And the European so-called peasant class slaves were like, we've had it with this, chopped off their heads and demanded equal rights. They left Europe and went out into the four corners of the earth. And what the European slave, hashtag peasant class, did not allow them to do, maybe with the exception of Ireland, they did it elsewhere. Now, what am I saying today? And what the hell does this have to do with TTIs and 21st century slavery? Hold on one second. What does that have to do with 21st century slavery and Kalergi plan and feudalism? Think about what I'm telling you. Feudalism in Europe was a group of people, a minority, controlling all the resources, and then the majority were slaves. You can call them peasants all you want, they were slaves. Okay? And then the majority was doing most of the work and getting the least benefits. And there was a lot of corruption. There were a lot of abuse. This is why the same corrupting influence was exported with it. Here we are today, in a system where slavery is under a different name. So we see today it has a more sanitized name called the Kalergi Plan. But what exactly is the Kalergi Plan? The Kalergi Plan is feudalism. The Kalergi Plan is feudalism. It is conquest by a different name, but it's the same plan. So it seems to me that these people, every 400 or 500 years, they change the name, but the agenda is still the same. Reclassify the history, erase the history, wipe out ethnicities, change cultures, force different cultures down people's throats. and then enslave. Now, the Kalergi plan is specifically geared towards Europe. But what I'm trying to show you is this Kalergi plan that we call Kalergi plan today had a different name 400 years ago. The name 400 years ago was conquest. And when they were conquering, they used religion to get land and human slaves. The Kalergi plan is the same thing. Conquer the land of Europe and make white Europeans slaves. The Kalergi plan 400 years. Conquer the African continent and make black people slaves. I'm going to say it again. The Kalergi plan is a new name, but it's the same agenda. 400 years ago for slavery, black slavery, it was called conquest. No, for black slavery, it was called civilization. I'm sorry. For the Americas, it was called conquest. But it was the same ethos. Use religion to impose upon a people with the end goal of stealing their land and making them slaves. And the Kalergi plan in Europe is the same thing. Impose an agenda upon Europe, steal the European land, enslave the Europeans. And some are saying, no, this is far-fetched. You're black, why do you care about Europe? Honestly, I don't. I'm just showing you historical references why what is happening in Europe today is what was allowed to happen to Africa, what was allowed to happen to India, what was allowed to happen in China, what was allowed to happen from Canada all the way down to Chile, the Americas, what was allowed to happen in the Caribbean, what was allowed to happen in the Pacific. Again, have this diabolical plan where the end goal is still the same. Export a religion. They used religion then. Today, they use humanitarianism because people are not falling for the religious bullshit anymore. Religion was used then. Their Kalergi plan of yesteryear was religion. Their Kalergi plan of today is humanitarianism. Oh, you have to help the migrants. If you want to help the migrants, stop fucking bombing their countries and stealing their resources. If you don't want migrants in Europe, then let the Africans control their resources and let Black Africans control their land. If you don't want Middle Easterners in Europe, leave the Middle Eastern oil to the Middle Eastern people and leave their land for them. If you don't want an Asian invasion, let the people have their land and their culture and leave their resources to them. If you want Europe to remain white, then you have to stop bombing countries that are non-white. Number one. And number two, you have to do things to preserve your Europe that doesn't come at the expense of other countries. The Kalergi plan is not new. But what I don't like about the Kalergi plan, there's nothing about it that's good, is that what I'm trying to say is this. It is the same fucked up doctrine that was done to exterminate Native Americans, that was done to enslave Black people, that was done to colonize India, that was done to colonize Africa. Now we see the same creatures. You see how long they plan? Now this is 500 years now. When we look at slavery and the new Americas to today, we're looking at 400 plus years, right? We're looking at 400 years. We're looking at goddamn 400 goddamn plus years. But the plan is the same. Now we see that these long-range creatures, because they never die, with the same plan, now their goal is back to Europe to destroy Europe. And to cause unnecessary hatred, because they never seem to rest when the world is at peace. It's like these people worship the fucking misery demons, that they can't, the demons of like miserable demons. They cannot see humanity at peace. They're always up to some diabolical scheme to make people fight with each other. Now, am I saying that Blacks and Middle Easterners cannot live in Europe? No, Blacks and Middle Easterners should live in Europe, but Europe should be for white people. Africa should be for Black people. Asia should be for Asian people. The Middle East should be for Middle Eastern people, and we should not tolerate any group trying to change the fabric of these countries. Now, when it comes to the United States and the Americas, the damage is already done. You can't bring back the 200 million Native Americans. They're dead. You can't reverse slavery. It's done. So the fabric of the United States is already cosmopolitan. So we already have to, this goes back to the new Atlantis. You see what I said when I said, this plan is not new. Now, what the hell does this have to do with owning land and enslaving people? Whenever we see these plans at work, let's look historically. Whenever we see these plans at work, these plans always have two agendas in mind. Stealing the land with the resources in it and making people slaves. And one of the currencies of the future we have to be aware about is not fucking cryptocurrency. It's not goddamn cryptocurrency. It's the currency of you and me. When we look at feudalism in Europe, the currency was the peasants. When feudalism left Europe and came to the Americas, the currency was the Native Americans. When they died out, the currency became Black Africans from the African continent. You see how this plan is again? To the Americas. When we look at the colonial currency, the Indians, the Chinese, and the Africans, and the people in Australia, the people in New Zealand, they became the currency. And now we see the diabolical plan of Kalergi back in Europe to make the European people the future currency. What the hell does this have to do with TTIs? I already said it. It is not a targeting program. It is a trafficking program where the currency of that program is the buying and selling of people. I am not a Bible thumper, nor am I a Christian. But let me show you something in your own scriptures, because many of you are in fact Christians. Let me show you something. Okay, let's look at this from this way. Let me just look at it here. Look at this. Revelation 18. Listen to what it says. Listen to what it says. If you think I'm joking, remember that feudal system and that mercantile class, that feudal class, that class where there's a small minority controlling the vast amount of lands on the planet, and they control all the areas of activity, and then the majority of people on the planet controlling next to nothing. Okay, and now this was written 2,000 years ago. Okay, now I'm not a Christian and I'm not saying this is the word of God or anything, but it's good to show you context of how old this plan is and how this same Kalergi plan, this colonial plan, this slavery plan, this subjugation plan, how old it is. Look at this. And it goes back to that mercantile or mercantile feudal class that controls all the areas of activities. And the vast majority of the planet controls next to nothing. Look at this. Revelation 18:11. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Cargoes of gold, areas of activity. Where do these things come from, people? Where does gold come from? Silver come from? Precious stones and pearls, well, pearls in the sea. Fine linen, purple, silk. All these things come from nature, and the vast majority of these things come from in the earth, which is land. And scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood, and articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble. All these things, with the exception of the pearls, comes from some part of the earth, land. Cargoes of cinnamon and spice, incense, land, 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 land. Myrrh and frankincense, wine and olive oil, land, land. Fine flour and wheat, land. Cattle and sheep, land. Horses and carriages, land. And get this. And get this. And get this. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn because no one will buy the human slaves. And this is a 2,000-year doctrine. This is a 2,000-year book. This is a 2,000-year book. So let's look at this. Let's look at this. Let's look at this. This is the mercantile class again, merchants. And I'm not against mercantilism or mercantilism, mercantilism. See, we go back to medieval Europe. You see what I said to you about that medieval Europe? They really call it medieval for a reason. Middle of pure evil. Why? Again, feudalism. And we're going to look at the centuries and what came out of those centuries in Europe. So the merchant class, and this 2,000-year-old book tells you about this merchant class and how this merchant class sold humans. The merchant class. And the merchant class were in medieval Europe. That is the 13th and the 14th century, the Middle Ages. And these people in Europe, let's look at this. Merchants of the Middle Ages. Merchants in the Middle Ages were business people who participated in retail and trade. Look, the merchant class of the earth will weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargo anymore. Now, I'm not saying that the fall of Babylon will come, and I'm not saying this prophecy is true or real. I am just saying this is 2,000 years telling you about the theft and acquisition of land, the buying and selling of things on that land, and the areas of activity going to one group of people, and it always leads to slavery. It always leads to slavery. Whenever you have a system where a minority oppresses the majority through economics, it always leads to slavery. And we keep making the same dumbass mistakes. Because if it happens to someone who's black, I don't give a shit because I'm not black. But when it reaches my door, let's say I'm white, oh no, I'm white. You can't do that to me. Wherever you find this merchant class, it always leads to slavery. And this is 2,000 years now this was written. This is a 2,000-year-old book. And this is why I believe that this book was written by these creatures. But whatever. Let's look at this. Merchants in the Middle Ages were business people who participated in retail and trade. The term merchant comes from the Latin term mercer, which means, oh, look at this, trafficking. And from the French term mercier, which means wares. The medieval merchant was seen as both a trader and a trafficker of wares across countries. The Middle Ages merchant, meanwhile, this was written long before medieval Europe, sourced for his products during his travels and then sell them in markets and shops or at fairs. Do you know why this word is here? Do you know why this word trafficker is there? Because these merchants also bought and sold people as slaves. They were traders for goods, but they were workers because they sold people. I'm not going to go into the history of medieval society, but let's look at something really peculiar. Let's look at, now this is medieval Europe. We see this, right? Medieval Europe. Now let's look at something really peculiar. This is the 13th and 14th century, right? Let's look at the feudal system in Europe. And they basically cut their heads off. Uprisings. Let's look at the feudal system. The peasant revolt of 1381, that's 14th century. Feudalism, the peasant revolt of 1381. Feudalism was a popular system of government during the Middle Ages. Back to that mercantile class again. It was a custom widely held throughout Europe, especially in England. Now do you Americans understand what you were running from when you came to the Americas? When you came to the Americas as refugees and immigrants, you were running from this. This is what you were running from. And this is why your history books tell you that you were fleeing economic, that feudalistic system, and religious persecution. Serfs, another word for serfs is slaves, would work the land for vassals and lords who owned it in exchange. Like, why would I work for you just to get protection? I mean, these people were criminals. These people were the original gangsters, okay? What the hell am I doing working like a slave for you for goddamn protection? Where's my money, ho? Seriously. So I'm serfs. What's the meaning of the word serfs? Let me translate that English word for you, slaves. Okay? Okay. However, some people became upset and unsatisfied with this way of life. Why? Because the gangsters, this is a racket. This is what the federal government today would classify as a racket. And they will constitute this under RICO. So my question is, if this is under RICO, and this is gangsterism, and this is mafioso, what the hell am I doing working for your land and all you're giving me is protection? This is a racket. Why is it that it's bad for you to accept, but the other people in the world must accept this shit? Okay? However, some people became upset and unsatisfied with this way of life. Look at this. They were tired of being treated inferior and worked as slaves. Slavery was in Europe. Wherever you see this mercantile class, you find trafficking of human slaves. And this is a 2,000-year-old book. This is about 600 years, 700 years, I'm sorry. Wait, we just jumped. This is 2,000. This is 700 years, so 1,300 years into the future. And we see the same shit. We see the same shit. I'm glad people are asking really good questions. We see the same shit. Wherever we see this mercantile class, we see, the first thing we see is what they call, back to the old article, trade. And here in the 2,000-year-old book, it opens by telling you that their trade is gone. I am not against trade. I like trade. But what they're trying to show you here is that if you are not in the mercantile class, you end up becoming sold as a goddamn slave. 2,000 years, let's jump 1,300 years. They were tired of being treated inferior and worked as slaves. Slavery, this is what the original people who came to the Americas were running from. Being slaves in Europe. This is why when you read US history, they tell you, they don't go into depth of US history, but they tell you, they just say economic and religious persecution. What they don't tell you is they were literally running from slavery. But this same mercantile class didn't stop there. Let's read what happened to a lot of them. When the production of goods were low, right? Such a man was John Ball, a priest in Kent, who was a vocal opponent of feudalism. Because, you know, the feudalism was the system, and you and I were called slaves or serfs. He could be heard on Sundays after his sermons voicing his opinion to the commoners and the serfs. The Archbishop of Canterbury imprisoned him several times for his reckless words. Unfortunately, this did not have the effect he desired. Ball continued his public speeches even more frequently. After Ball's last imprisonment of 3 months, he, along with Jack Straw and Wat Tyler, inspired more than 30,000 men to join their crusade. With the help of some upper-class members, they were able to successfully march to London to see King Richard II. Okay? They wanted to see Richard to persuade him to change the current system. Let's go back to that wicked system again. 2,000 years, 1,300 years into the future. 2,000 years this wicked system was on the earth. 1,300 years into the future. This shit is not new. Into one that was fairer and treated everyone equally. This was happening in Caucasian Europe. Richard at first agreed to meet with them, but later changed his mind. Look at what happened. When the peasants learned of Richard's resistance to their demand, they stormed London with the help of some sympathizers there. They ever politely put it as they carved a trail of death and destruction. This is medieval Europe. We're looking at 13th, 14th century. They slaughtered the feudal lords. Let me say it nicely. They butchered them. Executed were prominent upper-class lawyers and other officials. One wealthy citizen of London, Richard Lyon, was beheaded. He happened to be the man Tyler was a servant for during the wars in France. The wild frenzy continued in London until it was later crushed by Richard. There's so many more peasant revolts, slave revolts in Europe. They call it peasant revolts, but it wasn't peasantry, it was slavery. When these feudal lords were getting their heads chopped off, now this is 13th, 14th century Europe, okay? 1381, that's the 14th century, the end of the 14th century. What happened? Can anyone take a guess as to what happened in the following century? Europe was saying, we've had enough, we need land, we need equal representation, we need to be treated with respect and dignity, we want equal rights. So a lot of them who couldn't get it left and came to the Americas. But what happened in the 15th century? Can anyone guess? Slavery. These same feudal lords who saw that they were losing their hold on the vast majority of the European population formulated a plan to acquire land and slaves outside of Europe. Let us look at slavery in the Americas. I'm showing you how old this plan is, how old this Kalergi plan is, how long this Kalergi plan has been going on under different names. Okay, so let's look. This says 1619. So the 17th century. Okay, hold on. The treatment of, okay, in the United States, if you use 13, no. This is garbage. It's older than this. I knew that. I was like, this? No, that's United States. Okay, between 1502 and 1866. Okay, let's just look at this. This gives a later date. But this is more accurate to the date. That's more like 16th century. But we know this is minus Arab slavery. Arab slavery is about 1,200 years old. Okay, exactly. It was in fact the 1500s, because it was in fact the 1500s. So we're looking at the beginning of the 16th century. Okay, so what do we see in Europe? We see that the European people said no to this Kalergi plan. The Kalergi plan that day, that under that name, okay, it wasn't just mass migration. It wasn't just mass migration. There are various aspects of that Kalergi plan. The Kalergi plan in Europe today is using mass migration to change the ethnic fabric of Europe, to allegedly dumb down the population and do what? Use people as slaves. Because they'll be less resistant to fight, and this is their belief, they'll be less resistant to fight them. If they're so mixed, they'll be busy fighting each other. That's the Kalergi plan. Now let's look, that's part and partial of the Kalergi plan. But the other part of the Kalergi plan is what? Taking land from indigenous people. You can't have a Kalergi plan where there's mass migration into a foreign country without reallocating indigenous land to the people who live there. So let's look at slavery and this Kalergi plan at play. Right? Let's look at slavery and the Kalergi plan at play. Okay? Now we see in the 16th century, the beginning of the 16th century. So what just happened here? This is the 14th century. This was going on in the 14th, the 13th and the 14th century. This is the 14th and the 15th century. Hold on. The Middle Ages. Let me look up the year. The Middle Ages. Okay, excellent. You see, timeline is perfect. Lasted from the 5th to the 15th century. So we see that medieval Europe, the slave that lasted from the 5th to the 15th century, okay, right? It ended in the 15th century. Then we see what? 1502, slavery. And what happened during slavery? Again, exterminating the indigenous population, forcing a different population onto indigenous lands, and then terraforming that land into what you want it to be. This was slavery. We're seeing the same shit happen in Europe today. Am I defending Europe? No, this shit started there. But the point is, let us look at how old and how long this madness has been going on. The Bible is a 2,000, the Revelation is about 2,000-year-old book telling you that this merchant class controlled all the areas of activity, and when they gain total control of all areas of activity, we see the commodities market, gold, we see the precious metals market, gold, silver, precious stones and pearls. We see citron wood, ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, marble, cinnamon, spice. We see commodities market. I mean, newer technologies are obviously not in there, right? So we see different types of markets that they control. Textile industry. Okay. It always has a funny way of leading to goddamn slavery. It always has a funny way. It always has a funny way of leading to fucking slavery. Medieval Europe, we're jumping 1,500 years. At the start, slavery again. Then we see this corrupt, fucked up mentality translate into, again, terraforming land, genociding the native population. They're not genociding the European population. What they are, in fact, doing is trying to erase them from Europe and dilute them from Europe. Am I against foreigners living in Europe? No. Am I against foreigners living in Africa? No. Am I against foreigners living in Asia? No. Am I against them doing business? No. What I am saying is this: the strength of nations, the strength of people, the strength of country lies in their indigenous historical ownership of their land and them having the ability to manifest their destinies. And this is actually called manifest destiny. This shit. Another name for the Kalergi plan. Manifest destiny. I guess every 500 years they come up with these more sanitized versions for exterminating the indigenous population and then placing a foreign population in their land and then making people slaves. They always come up with some sanitized version. 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years, 500 years ago, they did it in the name of religion. Today, they do it in the name of a humanitarian crisis. It's the same fucking tired plan. Excuse my language. It is the same plan. It's the same plan. It is important that Europe remain European. It is important that Africa remains Black African. It is important that the Middle East retain their identity and their cultures. It is important that Asia retain, in the different countries, retain their identities and their culture. It is important because if we allow these plans to be fulfilled, we see 2,000 years ago, people becoming slaves. We see 500 years ago, people becoming slaves. We see 400 years ago, people becoming slaves. The question is, if we have historical evidence that shows us that when these merchants, the traders and traffickers, control all areas and all spheres of activity, when they control all spheres of activity, we see historically they do not stop when it comes to enslaving people. And if history is our benchmark for our vision for the future, then it tells us that we are one step away from being back to slaves. And to tie out what I was going to say is that slavery is not going to be like the slavery you and I know. That slavery is going to be technological trafficking, where a person can be a slave without the physical shackles of slavery, where human beings have no land of their own. They have no means of production. And once the human and the indigenous person is removed from their land, then they can be enslaved. Now, the slavery, the 2,000-year slavery we looked at, that was physical and mental slavery. The slavery of the 5th to the 15th century in medieval Europe, that was physical slavery and goddamn mafioso racketeering. You see how old these mafias are? God, these mafias are old. The mafias that are doing this today are some old ass mafias, mafioso families. Anyway, from the 5th to the 15th century, when they enslaved Europe, stop sanitizing European goddamn history. Europe from the 5th to the 15th century went through slavery. Speak the truth and shame the devil. Europe went through slavery from the 5th to the 15th century because serfs is another name for goddamn slave. Okay? And you were white when you were going through it. So it's no different from my black ass and my ancestors being slaves as well, because your ancestors were slaves from the 5th to the goddamn 15th century. The only difference is you sanitize your history and you erase mine. Now we see the 5th to the 15th century European slavery. We see from the 16th century to 1865, I always get the date wrong, African slavery, and in between African slavery, massive genocide. Where is that leading us? It's telling us that if we don't preserve nations, preserve cultures, I am for diversity. Don't get me wrong, I'm not an idiot. Nature thrives in diversity, but fish belong in the goddamn sea. Europe is for goddamn Europeans. Africa is for Black Africans. The Middle East is for Middle Easterners. Asia is for Asians. That is the correct way it should be. Can a non-European live in Europe? Of course. But the color and the ethnic and cultural fabric of Europe must remain Europeans, not at the behest of someone else. The color, culture, and ethnic fabric of Africa must remain African. Likewise for Asia, likewise for other countries on the planet. Why? These are protectionary boundaries. These are protectionary measures. They are protectionary measures. Am I opposed to interracial dating? Absolutely not. Date who you want. But what I'm talking about is macrocosmically, not on a microcosm with petty things like, oh, so does that mean we shouldn't diversify corporations? Grow the hell up, okay? That is not what I'm talking about. I am talking about literally wholesale changing the fabric of countries. I am against that. I am against wholesale changing the color and the fabric and the culture of countries. It leads to chaos. It leads to slavery. Am I wrong? Look at Libya. Libya was given democracy. And what's the first thing you saw happen in Libya when Libya was given democracy? The theft of land and resources. What was the second thing that rose up in Libya? Slavery. Let's look at Syria. Syria is like 10 different countries. The country has been balkanized. Let's look at Syria. If I am not getting to a point here, let's look at recent historical precedents. Let's look at recent historical precedents. Let's look at Syria. What happened in Syria? Again, the fight for land. And what happened after the fight for land ensued? A really unique anomaly rose up. Trafficking of women and children, slavery. So if we see it 2,000 years ago, we see it 1,000 years ago, we see it 500 years ago, we see it 400 years ago. Syria is about, what, 7 years? Libya is about 5 years. And we see the same shit, excuse my language, we see the same thing play out. The fight for land, because the resources are in the land, changing the color and the ethnic fabric of the country. And then a peculiar thing always rises up in the timeline of the Kalergi plan, of the colonial plan, of the slavery plan, of the conquest plan, because these are all the names, of the manifest destiny bullshit plan, excuse my language. We see the same three things: stolen land and stolen resources, genocide, because they got to remove the native population because they're going to fight for their land. You either remove them or subdue them. And then a really peculiar thing keeps popping up: slavery. 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 Now, with that said, am I against interracial dating? No. Date who the hell who you date is none of my goddamn business. Am I against diversity in corporations? Diversity is secondary to equal rights. If you know you are violating someone's equal rights because they're born with it by the decision you make, I shouldn't have to tell you how to diversify your organization. Because if you're a human and I'm a human and you bleed the way I bleed, then I shouldn't have to tell you if the person doesn't have the same skin color as you, but they're fit and apt to do the job. I don't need to tell you to diversify. That's just fucking common sense. What am I saying when I'm saying this? It is not in the interest of nations to change the color of their country, to change the ethnic composition of their country if it doesn't have a history of diversification. If your country is a homogeneous country, do not accept mass migration. And I'm not saying this for Europe. I'm saying this mainly for Africa, because Africa gets the brunt of this shit. But for Europe as well. Do not change the color of your country. Do not change the culture of your country. I'm talking about homogeneous societies now. Do not do it. It always leads to land grabbing and slavery. It always leads to land grabbing and slavery. And in between land grabbing and slavery, we see genocide, we see misogyny, we see abuse, we see all sorts of abuses. I am for diversity when there is a history of diversity. I'm in New York, I'm in a diverse place, and I love it. I love diversity. This is a place that has a history of diversity. America is a country that has a history of diversity. Okay? America is a different beast altogether. But most of the world is not America. This is why I believe that the new America, who's this bastard that wrote this? I'm telling you, these people are devils. Who's the bastard that wrote the new America? I forgot his name. That was a Kalergi plan under a different name. It was a Kalergi plan under a different name. But again, when you do this, it's detrimental on the people, because we always see land grabbing, genocide, oppression, and slavery. Okay? Does anyone have any questions? I hope you enjoyed this. Yep. Today's, exactly. So Emmy said, I think land grabbing is happening here too, Agenda 21. Yes, in America. Yes, I know about Agenda 21 and taking land in California and Texas. And yeah, especially in the states where there's like huge amounts of green land, like arable land. Okay, yes, absolutely. There's a lot of land grabbing going on in the United States. A lot of it. Okay, someone said code talkers. In the USA, a mistake then. Should they leave it for? No, you see, the New America. Who wrote this book? Oh God, I can't remember his damn name. Um, he wrote the book. Is it the New America? He was another one of these non-human creatures. Um, I can't remember his name. Damn it. I can't remember his name. Anyway, to answer your question, of course, in the USA, is the USA a mistake then? Should they leave it for the Native Americans? Okay, the honest to God truth is, when it comes to America, America is a different beast because the American, what happened in America, if you read this book, what the hell is the name of this damn book? The New America, shit. Anyway, the plan for America was to be the testing ground, okay, for a lot of what we see play out today, like the browning of Europe, the whitening of Africa, the, whitening of Asia. America was supposed to be the testing ground for this Kalergi plan. You see what I'm saying? And they were to force, exterminate, genocide the native population. And the reason why they had to genocide, I'm talking about the demonic mind of these devils. They had to genocide the Native Americans because they didn't want the Native Americans 200, 300, 400 years to rise up and slaughter them. So they had a plan. They didn't just genocide them to get the land. They genocide them and exterminated them and put them on reserves like they do in Australia, like they do in New Zealand, like they do in Papua New Guinea, like they do in the Andaman Islands. They did this so that A, they could monitor them, B, that they would never be able to reproduce enough for them to turn around and attack them for what they did. Right? So America, this United States, was supposed to be like like an experiment to see how this plan works. You see how this plan works. And is America a fair country? Not really. There's a lot of fairness here that you would get more than any other country, but there's a lot of corruption and a lot of goddamn corruption in the United States. Is the only difference is America just hides the corruption better than most countries, but there's a lot of corruption here. Maybe not as much as other countries, and it's not as open as other countries, but there's corruption here because all people in the United States are not treated fairly. Black people in the United States are still treated like shit. Poor white people in the United States are overlooked. They don't even exist. That kind of stuff. But for the most part, Black people are usually the ones at the bottom of the rung and get treated mostly like shit, right? So to answer your question, no, but to stem the tide of this diabolical plan, it's important to go back into the past and correct the mistakes. You see, you can't leave America and leave it to the Native Americans. There's only like 10 of them left. There's just hundreds of them. This is a huge country. If everyone left, there wouldn't even be enough Native Americans to populate all 50 states. So let's think reasonably. But America was designed the way it was. I forgot this damn book. I forgot the name of the book. Anyway, to be the test pilot for a lot of this shit. Okay, I hope that answers your question. Yeah, so Emmy says a melting pot. A melting pot is good. There's nothing wrong with a melting pot. If the melting pot is New York has a history of diversity, so it can work. Does it mean that people, let's say you live in a state like Utah and you're a minority, that people should treat you like shit? No. Being born a human trumps diversity. Because being born a human makes me a human equal to you a human. It trumps diversity. Because I'm born a human and you're born a human, we're the same. So equality trumps diversity on the basis that you and I are the same species. So if you're doing something to me that is harmful to me, that you know would be harmful to you, a human, why do it? Okay? So I'm not against diversity. I am pro-diversity, but I'm not for changing the color and the fabric of societies who are historically a specific color. It always leads to the same thing: oppression, genocide, slavery, and then some form of oppression. Okay? And the Oswaldo, the mercantile class, that's who they are, to answer your question about the rogue nations. Exactly. Emmy got it. She said, it is to regain complete control again. Complete control again. And it always goes back to getting ownership of that land. And wherever that mercantile class gets complete ownership of that land, you always see genocide that follows, slavery after that. And if it's not slavery, it's apartheid. If it's not apartheid, it's these color-coded, crazy-ass laws. We always see it. Nations should not change their color fabric. When I say their color fabric, Europe, I am not talking about the Americas. America is totally different. They're way along in this plan. America is out of this. I'm talking about Europe, Africa, Asia. Europe should remain white and controlled by whites. Africa should be black and controlled by black Africans. Asia should be Asian and controlled by the different color of Asians. These are protectionary measures. Okay, do you think they make the ones that are accepted in their group? Yes. So Emmy says, do you think they make the ones? Absolutely, because for them it's a sign of loyalty, that your loyalty is not even to your family, it is to them. To answer your question about acceptance into the group and sacrificing. Yeah, yeah, yep. Yes, absolutely. Malignant narcissism. But I think it goes beyond malignant narcissism. I think humanity is dealing with, because look at how long this planet is. 2,000 years? Let me tell you something. I can't tell you one human being that can keep a plan going for 2,000 years. You have to be a devil. You have to be a devil to keep a plan this diabolical for 2,000 goddamn years. You're a devil. You can't be human. That's just me. So I don't think it's malignant narcissism. I think we're literally dealing with non-humans. Not just me. Right? Yeah, we're going back to feudalism. And whenever feudalism takes place, today there's some lofty terms like oligarchy or corporatocracy or militocracy. Militocracy is when the military controls every sphere of activity. Corporatocracy is when the corporations control every sphere of activity. Feudalism. We're going back to feudalism, right? And we have to remember that the currency under feudalism, the currency is who? Not what. The currency is who? You and me. And this is where it ties into TTIs, because the slavery of the future, like the prison industrial complex of the future, like the social industrial complex of the future, will not be in physical chains. It will be in invisible chains where you are controlled from a computer. It goes back to slavery, but the slavery of the future is not physical chains, okay? It is technological chains with an invisible goddamn remote, okay? And I'm sorry I'm using such colorful language, but it's to get a point. Right? Cindy, here's my advice to you. I am glad you should be proud of who you are today. Because Cindy realized that her family owned plantations. You seem like a logical, reasonable person, okay? You should be proud of being an empathetic human. But you can also spiritually, Cindy, go back and correct the mistakes of the past. You can do this spiritually. You can do, I am not saying go around to every Black person and tell them, I'm sorry that my ancestors owned plantations and genocided Native Americans, because some are rightfully angry and filled with hate. I'm not saying do that. What I'm saying to you is this. You seem like a logical, reasonable person, okay? And you seem like one who is empathetic. You understand? Because the people that piss me the hell off is the people who are just like, I'm white and I'm right. And I'm like, okay, when they enslave Europe again, don't cry to us Black people because we warned you. Okay? So what I'm saying to you, Cindy, is you can do spiritual exercises. You can do spiritual to correct the mistakes your ancestors made. And that is what I think most Black people are asking for. Most Black people are asking for structural changes and corrections of you not calling slavery conquest. That's not conquest. Because when it was done in Europe from the 5th century to the 15th century, the Europeans got sick and tired of being fucking slaves, excuse my language. They got sick and tired of being slaves and they cut their heads off and killed them. There was a trail of blood in Europe. Matter of fact, Europe had many trails of blood before they came to peace. It's really fascinating European history. Europe has been fighting since that continent came up from under the sea. There's so many, go look at how many wars occurred in Europe. It's literally thousands of wars. It's really fascinating. It's a country of bloodshed. It's a continent, sorry, of pure and utter non-stop bloodshed, you know? But when Europeans were slaves, lofty term, serfs, slaves, there was a point in time, 15th century, where they said, no more of this. You see? So we could go back and correct the mistakes of the past because, again, they do follow you into the future. You see what I'm saying? So we can correct, but you can correct it in your own self and your bloodline. That's it. If people don't accept you for being a Caucasian person, they can kick rocks. But as long as you're a decent, empathetic person who's willing to look at history objectively, not from a superior complex, not from a fear complex, but objectively and say, look, slavery in Europe from the 5th to the 15th century was wrong. And it was wrong for them to export that slavery to the four corners of the earth. If it was wrong for Europe, it was wrong for Africa, it was wrong for India, it was wrong for China, it was wrong for all the other countries. You see? So that's all I have to say about that. Okay. Okay, so Bobby says he hopes to find a place where there are no targets. Help, please. The problem, Bobby, is if you're running around, which reminds me, let's look at something really quickly before I get off. This thing might be able to help you. I hope I remember what it's called. Hold on. Shoot. Yeah. Let's see. No. Hold on 1 second. Okay. what the hell is this thing called? It's called a ah damn. I forgot the name of the damn device. Oh, here you go. For yeah, there we go. This might be able to help you. Okay, can you guys see it? Exactly, Babu. Exactly, Emmy. It's happening to, this is what I'm trying to show people. It's literally full scale. Emmy says, I think this is happening to every race now. This is what I'm trying to show people. But they're making it look like, in Europe, they're making it look like, oh my God, the brown people and the black people are trying to exterminate the Europeans. And I'm like, and the Africans are like, oh my God, the white people exterminated us in Africa. And I'm like, guys, both of you are wrong. It's a mercantile class who has a history of doing this to everyone. Anyway, this device is $109, okay? And this is an EMP device, okay? And this EMP device is for slot machines. I don't know if it's going to be strong enough to help you, but I would say give it a try, okay? And to tell you the truth, I'm not sure how it will work, okay? But it's an EMP device. Let's look at at the features. It might be able to work because this can literally short circuit. It can literally short circuit a slot machine. And why am I talking about this EMP device? It might be able to short circuit. Oh, I hope I can. But let me just type it up for you. It might be able, I'm not sure, but it might be able. Hold on. It might be able to short circuit the chips. Okay? Because if you're being tortured and monitored and tracked and followed, you have nanotech or some type of technology that's inside of you. Okay? And this is, if this is strong enough, to short circuit a slot machine, okay, it might be strong enough. It might be, I'm not sure. It just might be strong enough to short out the chips that's inside of you. You see? Jammer, slot device, machine test in casino. Let's look at Jammer. Yep. I mean, I don't want to play this video for too long, but let's just do it really quickly. Okay, so let's see here. So, sorry. Okay, so I'm not sure. I haven't tried it. I haven't tried it, but an EMP device should be able to jam the chips that are inside of you, because these slot machines have chips in them. Do not go use these things for slot machines and get yourself arrested and get into trouble. I'm saying if you want to jam the chips and short circuit the chips in you, an EMP jamming device, and one that they sell is for these slot machines. Okay, so anyway, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. Thank you for joining me. Let's stop this. Thank you for joining me. I hope this conversation enlightened some of you. I hope you understand where I'm coming from. And I hope you don't think, oh, this is racist. No, we should all accept. No. Diversity works in places that can handle diversity. When they're trying to introduce diversity into homogeneous societies, it's always a land grab. It's always acquisition of the natural resources. It's always an agenda to genocide the native population. And those who survive, the end result is always slavery. And slavery of yesteryear, 2,000 years, 1,500 years, 500 years, up to today, the slavery of yesteryear, which is shackles and chains and being whipped, is not the slavery of tomorrow, which is secretly putting an implant inside of the person and remotely controlling them. Okay? We need to leave countries having their ethnic identities and their culture and their history, and they must preserve it. They must not export that as a cultural global domination plan. The world doesn't want that. Keep your global domination plan for you and yourself, but you have the right to have your color-coded ethnic diversity. Okay? I hope this makes sense. I hope people understand this is not about racial superiority and inferiority, and I hope people don't get offended. If they get offended, they can kick rocks. Take the time to understand what I'm trying to say, and if you can't, that's not my problem. Okay? Oh, Bobby, I'm not sure, because if it can short circuit a machine like that, I would test it out on I would honestly test it out on like if you have an implant somewhere else, I'll test that out somewhere else first, little at a time. But you know what? It's up to you. You know, I test it out a little at a time first, you know, before I go and zap my head, you know? So, okay. So, all right, guys, so it's 2 o'clock in the morning. Thank you for joining me. Thank you so much. I hope this meets you I hope you get where I'm coming from. I hope you see this long range plan that's taking place, and I hope you do something about it. Keep your identity, keep your tradition alive. It's okay to respect and love people from other cultures, other countries, this and that and the other, but it is not wise when your country is homogeneous to introduce mass migration of people from another country. It always causes serious problems. It is not a wise move. Historically, it didn't work, and it's not going to work today. All right, peace out, love you, take care of yourself.